No break. And right now we are going to address the next panel that is called Cross-Border Data Flow. It's aligned with electronic signature and security. That's why we have two friends of ours that are going to discuss in this panel. We have Humberto Carrasco from Chile, the Dean from the University of the Northern part of Chile. That is going to be our moderator, Jorge Navarro, who's a specialist in electronic commerce and new technologies from Mexico. And Maritza. Maritza Yesenia Aguero, President of the Internet Governance Center, USMP from Peru. So we have Mexico, Peru, Chile, and Raúl Echeberria, who is the Executive Director of ALAI, and I'm sure he's going to be based in Uruguay. So it's a panel pretty representative of Latin America, one can say. Are we all set? 1 minute? Okay. I think this presentation is very interesting with the open protocols, what Oscar said. Imagine if we were to pay for every time we use the TCP/IP protocols, we wouldn't have developed the internet as it is now. And if it's proven to be an effective and resilient model. Maritza, are you there? Hello, how are you? All right. Good.
¿Aló?
¿Cómo les va? Hola Humberto, querido. Hola Raúl. Hola Jorge.
Hello Raúl, hello Jorge.
Espero que todos estén bien.
I'm sure everybody is okay. We are here broadcasting live in the YouTube channel from the South School of Internet Governance. We had Oscar Robles Garay from LACNAC, and they were telling us that they're hosting an experiment and exploring new opportunities with a hybrid conference. It's great that you are going to gather in Montevideo, so hopefully we are going to have or hold an in-person conference. But for now, it's going to be online. I'll give the floor to Humberto, that is our moderator. So thank you for being here in this panel, that you're here with us today. It's great. Okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Olga, for introducing us. I'm fortunate to be moderating this panel together with Jorge Navarro, Raúl Echeberria, and Maritza Yesenia Aguero. I've known them for many years. With Maritza and Jorge, we attended the same university, Queen Mary. We shared some classes with the same teachers, so it's great to moderate this panel on cross-border data flows, which is a topic that is trending right now in connection with personal data protection, especially during the pandemic. I would like to make a brief summary here because the pandemic made us create many applications precisely to do some follow-ups of patients, and this created an impact on the scientific world and in civil society and in corporations to see if we could treat the personal data as a result of the pandemic in this way. And this was highly discussed, especially what happened with the servers, if they were gathering information, if it was out or in the jurisdictions of any country, you know. By way of introduction, just by way of example, imagining in Chile, there was a successful bidder that it was a Chinese company in a proposal to issue the ID and the passports in Chile. Imagine if they send the data cross-border to China, so you have an issue of cross-border data protection and the disputes that are being created. with this case. So, having said this, without further ado, I will start with Jorge, and later on, since these topics are relevant, the rest of the speakers will follow suit. Jorge, over to you. Great, Humberto. It's great to be here in this panel. Olga, Adrian, my acknowledgements. It's an honor and privilege to be here to address this presentation in this forum, in this virtual forum at this SSIG. I prepared a PowerPoint. Can you share it? Humberto, is there any chance that you can share the screen? Okay, great. As I was telling you, I prepared a very brief presentation in connection with cross-border data flows. Where we had relevant information in connection with the report in 2021 prepared by UNTAD. And there are many interesting results that arise out of this report, addressed by the UN Conference on Trade and Development. So there are many or quite a few items that become relevant. First of all, we are aware that digital personal data are at the core of new technologies or emerging digital technologies like data analytics, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, blockchain. Now, the rest of the services that are related to the Internet imply the managing of reaching the SDGs successfully proposed by the 2030 agenda at the UN. The Internet governance and the cross-border data flows impact on many items, on trade, on innovation, on e-commerce, on wealth distribution, and especially the business dealings or transactions out of massive digitalization. But we cannot overlook these specifications to protect human rights, to protect personal data, and national security. It is difficult to quantify the assessment of personal data. However, there's been exponential growth driven by the pandemic. We estimate that nearly, or that for 2022, we're going to have more internet traffic than the traffic since 2000 that we had since 2016 as a whole. The statistics that we use to analyze for cross-border data flows, we have noticed that have increased by 35%, and the global traffic on a monthly basis that we can quantify for 2020 was 230 hexabytes, will almost double to 760 exabytes. So it's quite an exponential growth. To estimate this rate of this traffic rate is in line with international bandwidth, but at the same time, the metrics do not really tell us how cross-border data flows go. For example, like the Chinese company in Chile that would be implementing the passport issuance service in Chile. I'm sure that they're going to have data flows being transferred to China, so it's a cross-border transfer. Based on these metrics, probably we could find the direction and the nature and the quality of this data. Traffic has been primarily focused on two routes, one coming from the United States and Europe, or North America to Europe, and the other one from North America to Asia, which explains that digital economy creates large imbalances. There's a lot of digital divide here. If we just see the emerging countries or the emerging economies, only 20% of the population are internet users, and they have access to low speeds. If we see the digital divide in developing countries, out of 10, 8 make transactions online, just like in America and Asia. And in developing countries, only 1 out of 10 does e-commerce. Obviously, this is worse in the locations where Aboriginal peoples live or in the rural sectors. So we shouldn't lose sight that only almost 30 million people in Latin America come from Aboriginal tribes, that they have been severely hit or affected by the pandemic, let alone the migration problems that we have had. We have a migration wave trying to cross borders to reach Mexico or even the United States. And we have cross-border data that they're not really visible. They don't really create humanitarian crisis, and if we were to manage this data successfully, we could find a solution probably to these problems. Needless to say that the United States and China are at the forefront of having these capabilities, of having these benefits in cross-border data. 50% of data centers located in the world Okay, I'm sorry, I got confused with the message here, but let me get back to the United States and to China in connection with the data centers and with 5G technology adoption. Precisely, these two countries account for 94% of those that adopt this technology with data analytics, artificial intelligence. Companies like Facebook, Amazon, Alibaba, those are the ones that made the necessary investments in all the links of the chains, from gathering data, user data, and also the transmission of data, making the necessary investments. And data storage, there has been major investments in data storage. And one could see that these companies are far from being platforms. Right now they have become multinational global corporations that they have a worldwide presence with enormous economic technology power in the marketplace and with large quantities of data, of user data. Okay. Now, these luminaries have a stronghold in the market as a result of the pandemic, and they've become dominant players in it. So increases in their stock of 17% have been reported in these technology companies. In the case of Facebook, the stock they increased by 55%, 144% in the case of Apple. Well, when the Monday stock was down, when there was a capital representative report this an abuse in the company, and that's why the social media was down during Monday, and that basically created a decrease in stock. But we're not only faced with digital divide in the traditional way in terms of connectivity and access and internet use, but also we have seen that there's a new value chain for data that has created an impact. There's an important process from the time we gather the data, the user data, and then we go through an analytics, or the way they analyze this data, and then a digital process, which they use to monetize those products or services related to the digital economy. The problem lies that these data are no good if there's no demand in the market or artificial intelligence in the market, and if we cannot analyze these quantifiable data with artificial intelligence. However, there's a risk that emerging economies become mere providers of data for these digital platforms, and in turn, they will have to pay for the information that they have gathered based on the data that these economies have supplied. Also, with cross-border data flows, we have seen that there's not a universal objective. I mean, there are differences. This intangible asset cannot be quantified in a traditional point of view or classified in goods and services as we traditionally did. They are not that intangible. I mean, its use is not depleted by using it. However, if we combine the analytics with algorithms, one may find more valuable data where we may create more value added, and in turn it becomes more profitable. And because of technicalities or legal aspects, we end up creating exclusivity, or the aspect of preclusion of this data. And the nature of this data has many pillars. You have the economic perspective that can create a private market price for those that control or house this data, and also there's a social value for the economy. But the benefits out of this treatment of data is very uneven. So it's very important that we should protect personal data. It covers personal data, human rights, and national security. In general terms, they lead us to create a new model of data governance with a global nature. We have a clear model in the United States where priority is placed upon individuals with their personal data. Then we have the Chinese model, highly focused on data control exercised by the government, and the European Union, which focuses on users' rights, that is, the holders of those rights or data. And there's a dysfunctional difference that sometimes does not match, and we should create discussion spaces where we could lead this to coexistence with a new regulation. Global data governance could allow for co-participating data that could become public goods, given the challenges of humanity like poverty, education, hunger, climate change. And data could create a cross-border coordination, which is essential to prevent further fragmentation in the infrastructure and in the digital spaces. Likewise, this is going to become relevant because we have 5G technology that should be more permeable and pervasive in our daily lives. Together with the unleashed digitalization provoked by COVID-19, there will be new trends for gathering data and for harmonizing this data at the global level. So it is important that we create some clear rules definition at the global level, since there's a major concern because of the lack of transparency in the value chain of this data and its unequal distribution in line with the benefits that this data create. One may argue that the proliferation of domestic regulation results into uncertainty for cross-border data flows and increases the non-compliance, especially for small and medium-sized companies that account for 80% of the companies that are incorporated in Latin America. The highest degree or the high degree of interdependence with the digital economy makes that the national policies that are adopted affect all countries where we have this cross-border data flow. The lack of an approval framework or regulatory framework created challenges such as the self-regulation model, where companies that are self-regulated create benefits for their own credit, disregarding the interest of users. Now, given the role that these companies play in technology that processes type of information, there should be some checks and balances. Having more participants or a multi-stakeholder approach that could become more relevant within this government model, and at the same time we should create an exhaustive assessment of the risks and the vulnerabilities and the results and the business models adopted by these digital platforms so they can be considered globally, so that we could guarantee knowledge, know-how on the part of the companies so they could benefit from these cross-border data flows to reduce digital divides that are firmly rooted in some of the communities. And we believe that developing countries should be represented in this framework in the way that they devise the future internet architecture across the world. And it shouldn't be a monopoly of a few, but inclusive of all those countries. And now over to the other panelists. Thank you, Jorge. Thanks a lot for your presentation. To tell you the truth, I believe that you give us a good snapshot. We would like to explain these three models, the American one, the Chinese and the European one, that I believe that they have become, they are the most influential, or the three models that have become more relevant for us. Thanks for your contribution. Right now, over to Maritza Aguero, who is going to be addressing her topic of today, and then Raúl Echeberria, and he's going to address cross-border data flows. But I'm sure that they have quite interesting analysis.
Thank you, Humberto. Thank you, Olga and Adrian, for the invitation. I think these kinds of initiatives are fantastic and terribly necessary. In fact, every day, many of the points that we see, to start with, to complement what Jorge brought up, a number of very exciting issues, such as the issue of this divergence and similarity between standards in different areas. The issue of cross-border data flow has lots of different facets. I'm going to look at it from the Peruvian point of view, because in Peru, the standard is based on international terminology. It's true that the pandemic has unleashed all kinds of different levels of questions about compilation. There are many opportunities in terms of information. When we talk about this cross-border data flow, or the transfer of information, we are obliged to rethink what we understand to be data and the value of information, the value of privacy, the value of sharing these elements. So it is undoubted that everything that we do on the networks, whether it's work or shopping or video conferences, presentations, for instance, all of this unleashes a series of concepts that we cannot afford to lose sight of when we are talking about things like sharing personal data. Peruvian standards, when we talk about personal data, we talk about what elements make you identifiable in any media, whether it's your name, your voice, your email, your biometric data, particularly when it comes to transfers, economics, monetary issues. There are different elements here. All of these subjects are based on consent. Consent when it comes to obtaining data. This has to be ex ante consent before data is shared. People have to give their express consent, they have to give informed consent, the scope, the way things are going to be done, and you adhere to the principles which cover everything related to data protection. And in Peru, we have 8 standards which are shared amongst a number of different countries. But the way in which information is captured, collected, and taken, and it's not only how you use it and share it, it's also because not all huge servers in their own organizations, because evidently the mass use of information, the number of transactions requires a much more robust support. Backups such as in the iCloud, cybersecurity, there are issues with cost savings and the mass use of information, traceability, and there are other elements which could, in terms of cost benefit, not be carried out in-house or even in country, but outside the country. payment channels, how you get a mailing with certain kinds of information. Modern payment forms include the use of biometric methods to identify users, authentication, digital face, all of these recognition, all of these things allow the person undertaking this transaction to do what they want. Humberto talked about something which the pandemic exposed was the issue of health. Health. Obviously, it's quite a sensitive issue. When we share information, whether it's about our lifestyle habits, our health habits, when we want an appointment with a doctor, this is all very, very sensitive information. We have a personal data law in Peru which sets certain obligations on all people who interact, but all the stakeholders involved in this data sharing exercise. Jorge said this very clearly. This is incredibly important. It requires that the person who is collecting the information, but how the personal data is used. And this touches on security because you don't want to end up being a victim, maybe of the unwanted transfer of data about your bank account. You might end up being the victim of phishing. And today, organizations are asking themselves, what is the right implementation in this context? Cybersecurity. This is very closely linked. It's very closely linked to market sustainability. When we talk about cross-border data flow, that the Peruvian standards says the definition is very similar to other countries. It talks about the international transfer of data to a destination in another country without talking about the media used or the support platforms. The point is that the information leaves and goes somewhere else. Conservation. How does it leave? Who authorizes that information to leave the country? Now, here in Peru, the personal data authorities has for some time been inspecting very strongly all those companies, not independently of the sector, whether they're working with the right levels of consent. It's like this is the new oil, right? This is the most valuable asset around at the moment. But we have standards. There is compliance involved, identification and consent. There are different elements involved because most of the Peruvian standards talk about a proper level of compliance. And what does this mean? There have been lots of guidelines. The OECD, for instance, has been working on these too, and they define this in terms of what security levels are given. So we talked about protection equivalences between countries, the equivalence of policies, and the issue here is that the model to be used must be comparable to that used in specific areas as well as a destination. So when we talk about cross-border data flow, we're talking about health sector, which handles incredibly delicate and sensitive information, which you have to protect in every country. At least Peru last year passed a directive about data flow in the area of health. And the OECD also produced a regulation about health issues, talking about capacity and identification. It's exactly the same. But you can't just, it's not just in this sector. Jorge explained that there is information related to companies and the commercial value of this information. And he gave us certain data, which was very interesting, concerning certain elements. But there was something that I would like to bring up is, do we really have the right protection standards for something like, for instance, cross-border data flow in the context of the pandemic? Does current legislation prevent the treatment of sensitive data, although some are particularly important for certain kinds of benefits corresponding to certain kinds of owners? But let's think about another kind of responsibility, other areas of interaction required. So we are, of necessity, required to diligently safeguard the confidentiality of the information delivered. Now, this raises certain doubts. We are all working from home, and, but we need to kind of draw up a map about certain activities to see if everybody has the right security levels involved in working from home. So we're based on the fact that, well, cross-border data flow, there is certain kinds of information that has to leave, it has to be protected, we need to be careful. We are talking about data governance, a set of processes and factors, roles, policies, standards, and measurements which enable this information to be efficient in order to determine and comply with certain objectives, comply with a number of processes, quality, security, and so forth. But we do need to think about what concrete actions need to be unified to enact these legislation. It seems a bit complicated at times because of the kind of information and regulation governing it, because there is not the right kind of standardization across the board at international level. I'm sure that there will be questions about this and there will be a debate. So if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. And thank you very much, Humberto, and the organizers, my colleagues and friends on this panel.
Aló, disculpen. Está muy bien, está muy bien. Sí. Me vinieron a preguntar que estoy acá en mi oficina, en mis obligaciones de decano, y justo me vinieron
I'm actually working at the moment as a dean, so somebody banged on my door, so I'm sorry about that. So thank you very much, Maritza. We're talking about data protection, sensitive data. There are different legislations, but these have not been standardized. I'd like to ask you later if you only protect individuals or companies. This has been an issue for discussion in Chile. But at all events, we will be opening the floor to debate. And now we move on to Raúl Echeberria from his experience in the LATAM Internet Association, can share his vision about cross-border data flow. Thank you, Humberto. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be sharing this panel with Maritza and Jorge. The presentations are very interesting. So the last person is usually the person that has to be more careful about the timing, so I will try to be as brief as possible. I think it's important to talk about a current data economy. And when I say economy, it's a very broad term. It's not just about business and the system per se. It's not just about the businesses that depend on data flow or the use of data, but also public services, educational services, recreation, entertainment. Data is amply used by innovative and traditional industries. Maritza was telling us and gave us several examples. I think about what we do every day. I work in an organization where we share out the work, so we share information all the time. But we also get information from third parties and we send them information too. And these are all data which are circulating constantly. Then we have our services suppliers, our consultants and partners, and all of this generates volumes of information continually circulating on the internet, sometimes accompanied by transactions, and all of this has to continue working. Also, for instance, the payment chain. I was thinking about the small and medium-sized enterprises, which, thanks to the pandemic, have had to shift their products and services and their relationships with the clients online. And financial transactions, small amounts, are fundamental. And this involves all kinds of information which is currently circulating on the net. So this is something that we have to deal with. That's why we're here. Those of us who develop policies have to focus not only on the challenges born of this situation, but also the benefits of such a large amount of data in circulation. Not just benefits, but the fact is that it's a sine qua non condition for the working of many activities. Having access in the current world to so many opportunities depends on that circulation and that data flow. There are commercial agreements and international ones which regulate data flow and serve commercial services. The general agreement on the commercialization of services, but these date back to 1995, terribly old. The digital revolution was but a twinkle in somebody's eye. So we need new regulations and new standards. And therefore, the regulators and the authorities need to think about how to offer citizens guarantees in this new context. And this is something that we have to work on. The principle here is the flow of data, not the non-flow of data. Restrictions should be based on concrete aspects, based on evidence. Maritza gave us some examples, such as health, where information is sensitive. But it's natural for us. We really ought to be taking these concrete situations and then analyzing them on the basis of evidence, as well as analyzing the costs of implementing these policies, because sometimes one naturally tends to take a more guarantee type approach to try and protect citizens throughout the spectrum of possibilities of different situations that might arise. And in order to cover all of these, we also have to take very broad-based decisions. And sometimes the negative impact of these can outweigh the benefits. A lot of people die just crossing the road. Pedestrians crossing the road get run over. Well, if we were to say what was the easiest solution, on one end extreme, we might say, okay, people aren't allowed to cross the road anymore. If people don't cross the road, we will be drastically cutting the death rate of people who are run over. It's true that, okay, you can get vehicles going on the sidewalk, so we will also have accidents. Nothing is foolproof. But it wouldn't occur to anybody to implement a solution of this kind because you need to weigh up costs with benefits. You need to provide guarantees, but based on the benefits when it comes to the digital world, looking at who is most affected. There are some studies, and I think there's one which I was reminded of, which deals with the costs implied for Europe if data flow was cut. This is quite absurd. Okay, imagine that data transfer was not allowed. What would be the cost? Taking Europe as an example, obviously the costs would be absolutely sky high, wouldn't they? So what is the solution for these guarantees, to provide guarantees to citizens? Because I think that we need to move away from this dichotomy. It's not particularly innovative as a thought, but I think we need to move away from either self-regulation or over-regulation. Over-regulation has a negative effect, and if the only alternative is self-regulation, that's not like that. Regulation is necessary. We have regulations in all areas of our lives as a society. We work as a society because we have rules, and these govern all of our activities. And it's great that regulations exist, but they have to be reasonable and proportional to the objective sought. They also have to be efficient without leading to unwanted consequences where the remedy might be worse than the disease. So what are these solutions? Maritza was saying this perfectly. There must be legislation controlling data governance. I could go to this in further detail, but I won't at the moment. But we must harmonize the rules, the personal data protection rules of different countries. And that regulation, as we said, has to weigh up people's rights and obligations when it comes to data circulation. Right. I'm not a lawyer. I sit here and talk to people who know so much more about this subject, but I've seen some examples of the Singapore Data Protection Act, which allows certain data to be used for innovation. Because once the institutions, both public and private, start to create expertise in data management, they find other ways of using them, which lead to innovation, which are beneficial for society. So there should be these kinds of exceptions contemplated, which don't stunt innovation. Jorge and Maritza said this. I think it's very interesting to talk about these three regulatory models. They take a general approach. There's the North American approach, which is just a little bit different from what my colleagues were saying, adding certain aspects, but basically it's aligned. We have the North American model, which is business-driven, right? Focused. They say, politicians say, our model is business-driven to enable a business economy. Obviously, it's not quite that black and white. It's that, but that's their basic approach. Then there's the Chinese model. Oh, surprise. I also actually say it's business-driven, but as Jorge said, there is significant state control. It's not only based on political aspects, but also cultural ones. So these are two different models. And the third one is the European one, which is the guarantee type model based on people's rights. And then we look at ourselves and we look it's like we have to choose from one of these three models. I don't think any of these three models fits with the objectives that we have as a region. We feel close to the European model because we have a rights-based culture. Latin America has this culture of respecting people's rights, thankfully. So it's good that our regulatory policy objectives should look for the respect and promotion of human rights, because that is a key objective. But unlike other regions, we also have other objectives which have more to do with development. So it's not the same. We could say that in Europe, regulation is an objective in itself. That role played by Europe in the ecosystem to play the role of regulator, but we don't want that. We want to promote respect for human rights, even as we don't block but empower our possibilities for growth and development, which places us in a very different place where none of the three solutions are appropriate for us. So we need to come up with our own. Some of the restrictions, for instance, we were talking about, Maritza mentioned that data location is not a solution. It is one of the obstacles because of the lack of global frameworks, and innovations made at local level often find themselves faced with barriers when it comes to data location. But data location is unfair from an economic point of view because those who can meet those requirements are only the big companies. So you're blocking off smaller entities and their access to the digital economy. And those big companies, in the global context, are probably still only medium-sized companies and would have major difficulties. But then there are difficulties regarding rights, because we don't want certain data to be locatable within a specific country, subject to the jurisdiction of that country, placing those citizens under the possibility of specific scrutiny if these are countries which don't necessarily respect and guarantee individual rights, and because there are all kinds of democracies. And then, of course, there are countries that aren't democratic, and those there are, but there are all kinds. There are some which are more robust than others, and others that are weaker. So the level of risk or the exposure of citizens when it comes to data location in their country, it's a complex issue. So those barriers bring up the issue of data location. And then there's, of course, the fragmentation of internet. By imposing rules that are not harmonized with other jurisdictions will lead to the fragmentation of internet. Latin America as a whole is a small market, less than 600 million people. Just China's double that. And also, we don't have a single market at regional level. So the risk of fragmentation could lead us to seriously compromise our potential for development. So what are the conclusions? I think I'm not going to try and compete with my colleagues' presentations, but from my point of view, the conclusions are that we need to think about people's rights, even as we think about our development objectives. We need to seek a regulatory model which is not one of the three that are on the usual menu. And we need to think about benefits as well as problems, and find a balanced and harmonious regulation, and seeks to harmonize the spaces in the region at a regulatory level, so there is greater potential for growth and development in the digital economy, as well as foster economic and social development generally. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Raúl. Ahora,
Thanks
si
a
tú
lot.
hubieras dicho
Thanks a lot,
ingeniería,
Raúl.
nadie se hubiera dado cuenta. Porque la verdad es que tu exposición estuvo a la altura de cualquier jurista.
I know that,
Muchas gracias.
you're not a lawyer, but your legal analysis was
Muchas
great.
gracias, muy interesante tu visión. Se nota que
Your vision has been quite interesting.
yo diría que viene de la experiencia, del conocimiento.
I think it's a practical approach from traveling so much, from what you do on a daily basis, and the roles that you play in the regulatory framework of the internet. Very enriching. I am fully convinced with this balanced model proposed by Raúl Echeberria, and it's not far from the future from what Maritza and Jorge were saying. You were like deep diving in that issue. Jorge and Maritza emphasize other aspects of cross-border data flows. Olga, I was going to ask you if there are questions from the audience, from the online participants at the SSIG. Yes, there are. Angelica from Peru, Angelica Castillo from Peru is asking, I would like to hear from cross-border data flows that you pursue and lessons learned in that experience. Maritza? No, it's just like for the whole panel. If you allow me. Cross-border data flows in Peru, we haven't had any changes to the norms or to the rules from the legislature decrees for some time. Neither any additional reforms or amendments or enhancements. But indeed, what was launched was criteria for developing that, especially when you have an audit. However, we don't have a modification process. We try to make this criteria uniform, which is basically in line with the international European criteria. With the GDPR, the GDPR did not affect our legislation. It is interesting to rethink some of the scenarios that you see on a daily basis, especially when a client comes and they said, well, I receive an audit and there's a record that they are requiring certain information. Basically, we see it in practical terms, but not a change that is necessary that needs to be made. At least this is the case for Peru. Raúl and then Jorge. Recently, we were just involved in the discussions on the data protection law that was passed in Ecuador. When you're saying cross-border data flows projects that were involved, I believe that involvement means the impact on the local legislation on cross-border data flows. That is, if under a legislation that, for example, what we discussed in the law of Ecuador, originally in the project, many restrictions that were comprehensive were set, especially for managing data of minors. So if you put more comprehensive standards or restrictions, and then you said, well, in order to transfer cross-border data flows, those are the jurisdictions that are similar to ours. In that case, you are making this criteria of data flows more complex. So that's why you become involved on a daily basis in this process. And we shouldn't disregard the issues or the elements related to law implementation or the legal implementation. because there are many loopholes or vacuums that needs to be solved when it comes to enforcement. So it depends on the criteria that you take when enforcing that law and when you perform the audit and the compliance. So there, you could take a more restrictive approach comparing the legal scope and in line with other jurisdictions that would make data flows more complex. Thank you, Raúl. Jorge, over to you. To take your question, let me see why we need to take this at the domestic. At APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Association includes Mexico, Peru, Brunei, China, and Japan. So in Asia Pacific, they have developed this process very comprehensively. And there are business drivers that have been implemented along these guidelines in APEC's guidelines. And in the Privacy Pathfinder, in that project, they wanted to establish a dispute settlement process that could be multi-tier. So claims could be substantiated or grounded in Singapore for a Mexican consumer that is buying from Singapore. Because of the language barrier, imagine that they will resort to English, but if they were with China, through dispute settlement, there should be operational rights, and those consumers' rights could be effective in China. So it's a dispute settlement process that's why I bring it to the table. And also an interesting issue that I see in professional practice is that sometimes the courts themselves have made these national criteria more flexible by including international standards or elements in their own resolutions. Like electronic signature, personal data protection. The court has acknowledged, in the case of Mexico, the inclusion of the model e-commerce law for construing many provisions under Mexican law. That is why it's important to raise awareness from the harmony point of view, so these elements become part of domestic rights by construing the case law of other countries. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Jorge. Olga, over to you. Any other questions? No. I have a question that is rather philosophical from the point of view of an engineer. I'm not a lawyer, so I have a complex of inferiority here. I see a very important reference to personal data protection, but what happens with other data, like, for example, wire transfers, e-commerce, industrial secrets, intellectual property? Those are part of cross-border data flows. Do they fall in the same items or same classification, or will be treated as something differently? I don't know if it makes sense, but I'm an engineer. Thanks, Olga. Yeah, the question is very, very important. Your contribution aims at sensitive data. Economic data, what we deal with, what we have to deal on a daily basis. Yeah, we're speaking about data comprehensively, a whole set of data. So when I say that policymakers need to understand the complexity and the big picture, and not only the innovation, but also, not only innovative-driven companies or innovation-driven companies, but also the traditional ones, educational, the entertainment industry. It, covers a whole set of industries, and this is the challenge that we have ahead for policymakers and for regulators when it comes to, creating rules and standards. Jorge? Yeah. In order to take this question, I believe that it is important to classify this information under three pillars, in three categories. First one is information. Information may contain personal data that identify people or individuals, or sensitive information that is strictly related to personal data itself, like gender, medical records, union, political affiliations. And the other classification that would be general information. Intellectual property and e-commerce topics. There's a lot of information that constitute a lot of data. Some of them are protected by other law, like, for example, in the case of intellectual property rights, like WIPO, and information that comes through information flows in the network that refers to data, or data that could not be personal data, like, for example, data of a vehicle. And in that case, there would be data treatment for fleet of vehicles that are monitored or under surveillance, subject to the information that is being transported or transferred, in that case, from server to server. So we need to understand this perspective comprehensively. So there should be a difference between data, information, and personal data. Thanks, Jorge.
Maritza tiene la palabra.
Maritza?
Gracias, Humberto. Muchas gracias. Bueno, en verdad, para complementar casi nada lo que han dicho los Raúl y Jorge,
to supplement to what Raúl and Jorge said very clearly, that will depend on the type of information or what is required to protect and the purpose of which, because it may be protected by some other kind of standard or law. And also there should be complementary protection. As we have seen in the presentation, the issue of the information is highly sensitive in many scenarios, and it may constitute the core business for any corporation. Thank you. Thanks. Olga, over to you. Okay, we're right out of time, so I would like to acknowledge all the panelists. Thank you for your interesting presentations. It poses many question marks given the current state of things and the scenario that we have in Latin America doesn't have a common market like the one in Europe that are interrelated, selling goods and services. And this topic is very important. Thank you for your time. Especially I would like to acknowledge Raúl and Jorge for your support and for sponsoring some of these activities here at the South School on Internet Governance and for holding this kind of online events, creating visual awareness compared to any typical online conference. Thank you for being the moderator. Jorge, miss you, but we look forward to seeing you soon. Maritza, Humberto, look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks and greetings from Oscar, Adrian, and my whole team. Wish you the best, that your families are healthy, and that once the pandemic is over, that we could meet once again in a conference abroad. Thank you. Thanks a lot. All right, we have a 15-minute coffee break. And then we're going to resume with the last panel, that is cybercrime. And then we have Adriana Costa from Interpol. She works at the Division of the Federal Police of Argentina. We have Horacio Solín, works at UFESI. Daniela Dupuy, the prosecutor, and then moderated by Sandy Palma, who is the CEO of Honduras Cibersegura. So we will resume at 6 o'clock in 15 minutes. 6:15, okay? Last panel of today. Thank you very much.